Everybody, tonight I'm going to be doing a little bit of maintenance on the Angelfish tank here. I'm really not going to do a lot. I'm just going to go in there and do a water change. Typically, if you're familiar with me and my tanks, I do fairly large water changes. I've got my water set up so that I can do that without really shocking the fish or making any kind of shifts in the water chemistry. So when I get in there to do a water change, I may as well make it count and do a pretty big one. I don't recommend doing that if you're not very sure about what you're doing and what your water chemistry is. You can really radically shift the parameters in your tank if you do too big of a water change all at once. I know I can do that, so it's not an issue. This isn't really going to be a video about water change, though. I just had to throw that little disclaimer in there in case anybody else gets the bright idea to do an 80% water change all of a sudden and winds up shifting their pH radically. And that's exactly what I want to talk about. I want to talk about pH shifting radically, and I want to talk about my CO2 experiments I've done recently. I'm still getting a few people questioning my methodology and things like that. So again, I want to just make it clear that this is not meant to be any kind of science. It's not meant to change the way you run your tanks or operate anything. It was merely just my own curiosity. I really was interested to see if my elevated levels of CO2 were having an impact on my tank, and it turns out that they were. I'm not going to go into all the methodology. If you can go back and look at the other videos and watch the whole process if you want. But during that process, I do have a friend that is a professional, and I kept contacting him, or attempting to contact him, and, you know, ask him questions along the way, you know, critiquing my videos. Am I saying the right things? Am I doing this right? Am I approaching this the right way? And he never got back to me, and I was kind of scratching my head. I just figured he was really busy and didn't have time. And I did actually speak with him this morning, and he deliberately did not get back to me because he was enjoying watching me go through this whole process of figuring out what's already well known and well understood. I didn't do anything groundbreaking or anything else. He was impressed by the fact that I was able to just sort of spot that and figure it out, and then was able to do the experiments to prove it out. But he knew all along. I've actually spoken to two people who said right from day one they knew exactly what the test results were going to be, assuming of course that my CO2 levels here in the basement are what I've been saying they are, and I know they are, not getting into that again either. So again, nothing groundbreaking. I'm not really going to hash that out. I don't really want to keep discussing this as though it's, you know, still into question. This is a well-known phenomena. This is not anything that I, you know, discovered on my own or anything like that. So whether this happens or not is not a matter of discussion now. But now that I'm aware of this, this is something I want to talk about a little bit. I do want to do a little more experimenting. Again, not to prove anything out, but just for my own sake. I like to know how things work, and I like to get an understanding of how things work. So I am going to set up a little experiment, and I will talk about that a little bit later because I want to get the water change done first, and we'll look at the after part, and you'll get to look at a nice bright tank with nice fresh water in it, and I will discuss what my experiment is going to be and why I'm going to do it. But I really did want to just sort of wrap up this whole experiment. It really was a fun journey. I appreciate all the input everybody gave me, and the direction and whatnot that people suggested, different tests I could try, and things to get to the bottom of it. So it was fun, it was interesting, and we did get to the bottom of it, and there can be no doubt that the atmospheric levels of CO2 have a direct impact on your tank. So the ramifications and the implications for what I have, I'll say, discovered is just simple things like that is now something to consider when you're scratching your head as to why your fish tanks upstairs have a different pH than your fish tanks downstairs. You can sort of reconsider whether or not you close your doors at night or open your doors, and just understanding a little more about how raising and lowering CO2 levels in a room and fluctuating it will cause fluctuations within your tank, and those fluctuations can actually cause pH shifts. A friend of mine I was speaking about is a saltwater guy, not so much a freshwater guy, and he has some friends that are professional reefers who actually pipe in outside air. They have ventilation systems set up so that the CO2 levels in the air remain constant, and then they can adjust their tanks the way they want them without having to worry about every time they enter the room their breath is changing what's going on in the tank, because they're generating CO2 when they walk into the room. So again, what I discovered was no big discovery at all. It's very well known, very well understood. Even small changes in CO2 levels of you sitting in the room breathing you know, while you're in there, could have an impact on your tank. Now, for my tanks, probably for your tanks, if you're watching my channel, this is not anything you need to be concerned about. This is for people with very, very sensitive coral reefs and things like that, the kind that the slightest pH shift overnight can wipe out, you know, tens of thousands of dollars of coral. That's what we're talking about when we get into the amount of sensitivity where, you know, slight little shifts like that will have an impact. For me, the impact is a long-term sort of thing. These tanks are in my basement, so they live in an environment that's got elevated CO2 levels. Therefore, my tanks have elevated CO2 levels all the time. If you're doing something like you spend the day in your office and you're breathing in there and you think, well, that's great, you know, I'm building these CO2 levels in my office, that's helping my tank. It probably is to some very, very small degree. But within minutes of you leaving that room, the built up CO2 in there dissipates and your tanks begin degassing. And within hours, they're right back to where they started. So you're not really having this long-term impact when you do things like that. In fact, you're having a more up and down yo-yo-y effect, which is even worse than simply keeping it stable at a lower level. The reason I have the stability is because this is my basement and my daily routine is fairly active. The amount of ventilation that's down here is fairly constant, and again, just through all my monitoring, etc., I know that my CO2 levels down here, even in the summer with the windows open, are at least twice to 3 times what normal background levels would be outside. And this time of year, they're probably 5 or 6 times what outside levels are. This time of year being winter, and the house is all closed up, and you know the basement is basically just collecting all this CO2. It explains why my tanks that have these lower need plants thrive the way they do. They don't need the really high levels of CO2 the way really true aquatic plants do. I'm not getting anywhere near those levels of CO2. Again, I'm not trying to say in any way that this is a way to skirt around having a high-tech tank. If you want to have one of those lush jungle-like planted tanks with all those bright red plants and all that luscious growth in there, you're going to have to inject your tank. That's just the long and short of it. You know, you would have to, the amount of CO2 you would have to put in the atmosphere in order to keep a tank in there to do that would be unsafe levels for you to be in. So you have to inject CO2 into your tank. But I am going to do a little experiment with that where I'm actually going to elevate levels in a microclimate but not inject, and I'm going to see if I can't have an impact on the tank. So sit tight, let me get started on doing this water change, and when it's all said and done, I'll go ahead and start filming again, and I'll tell you all about that experiment I'm going to do. It's very simple, and while it may not prove anything conclusive, it should give us a result, and then that'll be something to talk about, and we can go from there. So let me get started on this, and I will see you in a couple minutes. And that sure makes quite a difference, doesn't it? Now, I know what you're thinking, and I agree 100%. I like it the other way better, too. It does look a lot better, but it's just not realistic and practical to keep it that lush and overgrown with the surface plants. Just not enough light gets to the bottom. So between the massive water change I did that removed all those tannins, and do not underestimate the amount of light tannins will steal from your tank. As the light moves through the water, it loses intensity anyway. It actually loses its intensity on a squared rate. So for every time you double the distance from the light source, you quarter the intensity. And then when you're doing that through tannin stained water, a deeper tank like this, you really limit the amount of light you're getting to the bottom. And then of course when you physically block it with plants, then you know that's a no-brainer. You're really blocking a lot of the light. So in time this will grow back, and it will be no time at all. Within just a few weeks I'll be in there pulling plants out again and trimming things back. I'm considering trimming back some of that moneywort there in the middle. It's growing up to the point where it's actually lying across the surface. But for now it's fine. I really wanted to just get in there and clean that out. This is going to give everybody down on the bottom, plant-wise, a good recharge. It's going to get some good light to them for a little while as the water stains back up and as the plant cover grows back over the surface. And then, of course, I get to enjoy the process of watching this happen all over again. I get to watch my tank fill in, and then we can start the process all over again once it's all filled up. So What I want to do with this little experiment is I already know I get very lush growth on these low-level plants down here in my basement anyway, because of these high levels of CO2. So that's great. I don't really, I'm not trying to augment that or anything like that, but I am curious. I do like to know how things work. And going back to my original question way back at the beginning of this conversation about the CO2 that dissolves into your tank from a diffuser, I had questioned whether or not the CO2 that built up on the surface of the tank, CO2 being heavier than air, would tend to sit on the surface of your water, and would that microclimate of a very high proportion of CO2 further contribute to dissolving CO2 into your tank rather than just what was happening at the diffuser level. So what I'm going to try to do, and I am actually going back to that idea, I am still toying with that idea because I know how CO2 works, I really do, and I guarantee you if you've got a little hose that's squirting CO2 into the gap between the surface of the water and the hood of your covered tank, hooded tank, you will have extremely elevated levels of CO2 in that gap. They will dissipate. The heat from the light will generate the convection currents that will cause the CO2 to rise and move out of there. All of that notwithstanding, you still will have a very high density of CO2 in that gap. So what I'm going to do is the very simple experiment of setting up a basic CO2 generator. That's nothing more than a jug of sugar water with some yeast in it. I'm going to run an air line from that, which within 24 hours it'll be just pumping out pure CO2, not at a huge rate. I probably will put a bubbler on it so we can actually see how much CO2 is bubbling, but I'm not going to put the hose into the water at all. I'm just going to actually feed the CO2 into the gap between the surface of the water and the hood, and we're just going to give it a day or two, and if I'm correct and we really do dump a lot of CO2 into that water, we should notice a significant decrease in the pH. I've mentioned before I'm not really 100% clear on the relationship between dissolved CO2 and carbonate hardness, so I'm not really comfortable talking about that yet. I don't fully understand that process. I know there is a relationship, but it is not a direct one. So what I'm going to be doing may or may not affect the carbonate hardness. I'm not really sure what's going to happen with that. And again, this isn't anything that I'm trying to prove or disprove. I'm just curious to see what happens. I'd like to know if doing that, does contribute to that, because if that's the case, then if you've got an injected tank, whether you've got that tank hooded or you've got that tank open, may make a big difference as to how much of that CO2 is actually getting into your water. So I'm going to set that little experiment up over the next week or so. I've got a tank upstairs that doesn't have anything going on in it. It is just a tank that has a filter in it moving water around. So that will be a perfect test experiment. I won't risk any fish. I won't have any plants affecting the results or anything like that. We're simply going to fill the cavity with CO2 and see if that does not impact the tank. And if it does, how much? Am I going to dramatically lower the tank, lower the pH in the tank, or is it barely going to make a difference? I suspect it'll make a significant difference. I think we're really going to notice a significant drop, probably 2 or 3 tenths of a point. We might go from a neutral pH up there, we might go down to like a 6.7 or something like that. Just throwing that out there as a guesstimate at this point. We don't know, but it will be interesting to find out. So stick with me for all of this. Again, nothing real scientific, just fun, interesting stuff. I like to tinker with things and figure out how all the little bits and pieces fit together and how a tank works, and it's a hobby. You can just do that forever and still continue learning how things work. So stay tuned, subscribe if you're not already. You don't want to miss anything coming up. I got plenty of stuff on the back burner that will be working its way into videos pretty soon. I have not forgotten about my video about doing enrichment in your fish and making your fish happy, so to speak. That video is coming up. And again, the experiment that I'm going to be getting set up soon will be a series of videos as well. So thanks for watching this one. Hope you enjoyed. Rest assured we will have a nice dark tank again with all those beautiful roots and everything here in the very near future. This will grow back very quickly, you will see. Alright, thanks again everybody, and I'll see you on the next one.